Hi, my name is Kathryn Constantino, and my documentary was The Big Fix, which was mainly about the oil companies that were in Louisiana during the span of around 1967 to 2000s, like now. And so the main focus of this documentary was about BP, an oil company that had caused a lot of accidents, oil spill accidents, and their biggest one was the Deepwater Horizon. So the documentary starts off with the story of how BP began, in which they began in Iran once a geologist realized that a big part of Iran was built over oil. And so that's when they began digging and collecting oil, which got attention from Britain. So Britain came over and started to buy oil from Iran as well. But Iran then decided that they wanted to take back their oil, which led to the British CIA going to Iran and staging a coup, which ended the last democratic government that Iran knew. When this had happened, that's when BP decided they had to look elsewhere for oil. So now on to Louisiana. In 1938 was the first discovery of oil in the Gulf of Mexico, which is when BP came to Louisiana. And they began to move further out of the coast because of the technology they had created. So these oil companies, once they were building their rigs, it was only close to the coast. But once they started to advance in technology, they started to do it further out into the Gulf of Mexico. And with that, BP started to develop a reputation which was known as one of the riskiest oil companies, which gained them a lot of profit but had the worst safety in the industry. For example, in 1967, an oil charter ran to the ground at the coast of England, which led to over 100 tons of crude oil being dumped into the sea. Although BP was a risky company, it still brought a lot of jobs and money to Louisiana. So let's go to the incident of the Deepwater Horizon, which occurred in the Gulf of Mexico. And what had happened was that they were drilling over a mile of water and over 3 miles of the ocean floor. And when that had happened, methane gas was ignited and the Deepwater Horizon sank on that day. And oil began to spread for 87 days. Until July 17th, the oil was capped and the spill stopped. When actuality, that actually didn't happen, but we'll get to that later. So in Louisiana, oil had the biggest power. They had power over politicians, they had power over governments, they had power over science departments, they had power over science professors, they had power. And since they had a lot of power, it only grew stronger, and they began to drill wherever they liked. BP even grew to become the third biggest company in the world with John Brown. And John Brown made it to where he rebranded the company with an eco-friendly logo, which said Beyond Petroleum. Even though he rebranded the company to be an eco-friendly company, it didn't exactly take off as how he planned it to be. Because on March 23rd, 2005, 15 people died because of an explosion at BP Texas refinery. Once that had happened, Tony Hayward had taken over and promised that he would be focused on safety. And with that, BP and its contractors ordered the rig statistics of the dangerous oil on Deepwater Horizon. So back to the Deepwater Horizon incident, they had actually asked for the statistics of how the oil was doing and if anything was going bad. And in actuality, the chemicals and toxins of the oil were more advanced and higher than they had expected. And that was supposed to be the sign that they needed to get everyone off and that it was dangerous at that point. But BP continued on and ignored the statistics and decided to still have a party. And they actually had the engineer's phone off, but then actually 3 hours later, that's when everything shut off on the rig so it could run faster. And then that's when the incident occurred. So the thing is, with BP, they were supposed to have an oil spill response plan, but they didn't when Deepwater Horizon occurred. And in the oil spill response plans, it's supposed to have like incidents like this that could protect the workers and protect the sea on what would happen. But in the oil spill response plan that they only had scenarios that actually wouldn't occur at all. Like, they had specific incidents that, oh, if this animal was there, then they would do this. But the animals that was listed actually aren't in the Gulf of Mexico. Part of BP's plan was to clean up the oil spill that had occurred from the Deepwater Horizon. And so what they did was they started to get this chemical called Corexit, which another oil company had used, Exxon, had used for their own oil spill. And what they had found out from that oil spill that Exxon had created, and they started to use Corexit, was that Corexit was highly dangerous to any living animal and human, because it would cause rashes, it would cause chemical pneumonia, and so much other things. And it would actually lead to further health effects to people. And the way that BP also covered up the oil was that they would have machines that would plow through the sand and would layer sand over the thick oil. In actuality, there was 90% of oil that was still there in the Gulf of Mexico since Deepwater Horizon. And whenever you would go to the ocean or you would go to the sand, you actually had to wear a mask because the air was filled with so many toxins and chemicals due to the oil spills. And although Corexit was harmful and BP had known it, they still continued to use it. And even the EPA, which is an environmental group, had told them to stop the use of it. They still continued to do it because they said that it was the best way to get rid of the oil. And what else they had found out was that the mixture of oil and Corexit was even more harmful than oil just itself to people, but they still continued to use it. And Corexit was actually from Britain, but Britain had banned the use of Corexit. Even though it was from Britain, it was originated from Britain. So BP began to inject thousands of gallons of Corexit into the surface of the Gulf. And it was said that they used about 40 million gallons of Corexit. Okay, so now we're moving towards how much power BP had. So BP had so much power that they had a lot of control over political structures, economic structures, and as well as educational structures. So BP had one professor, they had paid him to start lying about the effects of Corexit and say that it was actually safe and that it was gonna break down all the oil and it was gonna help evaporate it, when in actuality it didn't. They had paid him about $40 million and even gave his university a grant of $10 million to help with science. But they didn't only do it to his university, they did it to other universities around Louisiana as well, so that they would confirm that Corexit was actually safe and that BP was taking the right route. They did the same with politicians as well. So they had paid a lot of politicians about $600,000, spanning from like $200,000 to $600,000, to say that BP was doing their best. Not only that, but that the oil was gone. That was the biggest concern, that they said the oil was gone, but when in actuality it still was there on the beach, in the sand, and at the surface of the ocean. And the oil spills that had occurred not only affected the ocean life, but it actually affected people's livelihoods. Since a lot of people were fishers in Louisiana, since they were at the Gulf of Mexico, a lot of them couldn't fish anymore because there was no clearance to fish in the areas that had oil and where the oil had spread to. So a lot of people had lost their jobs, their homes, their livelihoods, their traditions, their families, due to this oil spill. Not only that, but they still have those health effects due to the Corexit being sprayed all over the beaches and all over the oceans, and also due to the oil spill still being there and contaminating their water, their food. And actually some fishing companies still are able to sell the fish and their shrimp and their seafood, any of that. They're still allowed to sell it, and that gets transported all over the US. And it was shown that a lot of those fish and shrimp are still actually contaminated due to the spots that people were testing the seafood in. They were testing it in where places that are least contaminated, but were still contaminated. And also, what they did not realize was that the fish that they were catching and selling were eating contaminated shrimp as well. So in actuality, all of the fish they were selling was still contaminated and being sold all over the US. This documentary mainly showed how capitalism works, and that companies with a lot of money don't care about what happens to people. All they care about is money. And even in the documentary, one of the workers that worked for BP said the company just cares about the money. They don't actually care about the workers who are there. And actually, they would rather have the oil still spilling out so that those workers could still money and that BP could still get money as well. Because as long as it was covered up and that they were still able to drill, then they were okay because they were still gaining money. And it's sad because the people of Louisiana were greatly affected by all of this. They lost their livelihoods and they were being affected by the health effects as well. And not even their government could help them out because they were all being paid to side with the oil companies. And even some of the politicians encouraged the drilling of oil to continue, but they still wanted to clean up the oil that had happened from Deepwater Horizon. But how would you be able to do that if you still wanted to drill and get oil?